As I understand the timeline, this past winter, the Canadian publication Adbusters ran an editorial calling for an Arab Spring-like anti-Wall Street, protest of some kind. Uprising is maybe too strong a word in the United States to protest the excesses in the political manipulations of Wall Street. Subsequently, the call this fall was taken up by a loose congeries of who? That's the interesting question. Who exactly right now is in Zuccotti Park, otherwise known as Liberty Plaza, not exactly on Wall Street, but near Wall Street, protesting the excesses of big money and its influence on our government. Dana, you and I took a wander down to look at Occupy Wall Street and see with our own eyes what's going on down there. It has titillated the media, but there seems to be some substance to it, and it seems to represent something very serious in the national mood. What was your experience of going to look at this and seeing it with your own eyes?
Well, I'm definitely glad we walked down there to take a look, but I think actually my primary takeaway from the moment that we happened to go, which was just a down moment of the day when it was more of an encampment than a demonstration of any kind, was just feeling impressed and surprised and some wonderment that what seems like a relatively dinky little square in Manhattan with some grunge, I don't know how you describe them, gutter punks napping on pieces of canvas has become this global movement. I'm very interested now to see exactly how that space continues to symbolize something for the rest of the world where these movements are popping up.
Yeah, so I was in Spain on my honeymoon earlier this spring at the exact moment where the Spanish youth had a gigantic anti-corporate, why don't any of us have jobs, set of protests in Madrid and across the country, and saw a sort of similar encampment in Seville and thought, I wonder when or if this would ever come to the United States. I wonder if American culture could have a similar protest against the power of big money in politics. And here's our answer. And it is, I went down yesterday evening, which was a more active moment. I think every evening they have sort of an open assembly where as a group they kind of talk through what the big issues are and do they need to set up a welcome table and what should their demands be exactly? And a lot has been made of and written about their process, which is consensus-based and somewhat laborious sounding. And from watching a bit for a few minutes, it seemed much as I'd heard it described in a terrific Planet Money podcast about the process, which we should recommend. I'll put it on our show page. I feel like that we all loved Inside Job when we talked about it together. That seems to me like a major failing of the Obama administration is making any kind of movement on that. So I'm like, great, they're finally protesting that thing that I wish somebody would protest. But of course, if my issue were another issue, I'd be able to look at them and say the same thing.
Mm-hmm. But I have no quarrel with that. I mean, I know that there's been a lot of, of talk about, well, why haven't they settled on an issue? And in general, obviously, it has been a problem in organization on the left and demonstrations on the left that there's too wide of a net being cast with issues. But I think at this point in this movement, especially given the fact that there hasn't been any violence or anything ugly to have come out of any of these demonstrations, it seems completely fine that the net is cast wide.
Yeah, and I didn't mean that as a criticism. It was more a theory of why so many people identify with it or why in recent polls there's such wide support for it is because, in a way, it's not so defined.
I was also very surprised because most people have weighed in exactly this way. They've said, look, until it coalesces on a set of specific demands, it's really going to remain diffuse and somewhat anarchic and maybe a kind of empty expression of dissatisfaction as opposed to something with a political future and political leverage. But it did begin with a demand. It began with a single demand. As I understand it, the Adbusters very explicitly said, quote, beginning from one simple demand, a presidential commission to separate money from politics. Dana, when you and I went down there today, I felt like part of me felt like I'd died and gone to hell, which is to say I'd gone back to Wesleyan University. And there were a lot of rich kids in dreads and kind of freakish outfits. And part of me thought I had died and gone to heaven, and that all of the things, that we've been waiting for to actually coalesce into an anti-Tea Party are finally here and finally expressing themselves. And the one person I really wanted to talk to was a union guy, a hard hat, actually wearing a hard hat with a sign saying that he was a proud union member and he's here, to support the protests. I went over and asked him, who he was. He said I'm an iron worker, a member of the Iron Workers Union. I'm from California. I came here for a job. I have to wait for 5 weeks for the job to start. I'm here showing total support. He said we started talking about Dylan Ratigan on MSNBC. Guy was incredibly well informed, great guy. And the thing he said was one thing, campaign finance. I think if you were to Venn diagram every one of the people down there, the atmosphere is wonderfully carnivalesque, but if you were to Venn diagram all of their political beliefs and desires, they'd all come together on this one thing, get money out of politics. And an enormous, I think a majority of people in that park are totally aware of what A, Citizens United is, obviously, but also B, that they find the idea of corporate personhood absolutely risible, totally laughable. I think it's wrong to say that demands can't coalesce fairly quickly out of this cogent set of demands. And then one final thing about the quote-unquote freak show element of it, which I think the mainstream press and certainly the right-wing press are going to make major hay out of. I have two things to say about that. Every year, Gay Pride Parade is filled with people whose notion of appropriate public expression of private desire is completely out of line with my own personal tastes. I don't care. Gay Pride is a great institution. Gay marriage is a human right, and it's non-negotiable. It has nothing to do with the substance of the political demands at all. And secondly, my notion of what someone dressed up and speaking like a freak, my notion of what that's like is Larry Kudlow on CNBC. So all these people saying, oh, it's somehow something can be discredited because there's a kid in dreads and a funny jacket, they can go fuck themselves.
Whoa, mic check. Somebody needs to be repeating everything you say in Zuccotti Park.
Starting with Larry Kudlow.
Well, can I add something to your Venn diagram overlap, though? I think another, as you were saying to the union guy you were talking to today, if you could make a Venn diagram of what everybody in that park agrees on, it might just be a few things, but I think those would end up being the core demands of the movement. And I think another of them would be repealing the Bush tax cuts, right? Or just simply letting them expire.
Yeah, this wildly radical notion, this crazy socialistic notion that we should go back 8 or 9 years, to the Clinton era on the tax code, or 12 years to the Clinton era on the tax code. Incredible what now passes for a radical suggestion.
But as for the personnel in the park, I mean, by sort of making reference to the gutter punk, makeup that we ran across this morning, I don't mean to imply that the movement is restricted to that at all. I think it's very, very widely represented. But obviously, people that are able to camp out in a park for weeks at a time are going to be young people who don't have families, who probably don't have jobs, who are maybe students, right? I mean, it's going to be either people who are already homeless to begin with, or people who, as you say, have the means to just sort of drop out for a while. And if that's the spearhead of the movement, I mean, it's somebody holding the place for the rest of us.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like generally populist and popular feeling, and that something doesn't happen that makes the movement look so bad that the right then has ammo. That's all I'm hoping for.
Yeah,
now.
I'll give you a long answer as quickly as I can. We've run over a little bit. It's a big topic. I would say that the analogy here is Obama is to Occupy Wall Street what JFK was to the civil rights movement. When JFK came in 1960, people really thought there was going to be significant and meaningful movement on the issue of civil rights. When Kennedy dragged his feet and was quote-unquote centrist on this, or whatever he was, extremely conservative and unexpectedly slow, moving, that's when the Freedom Riders, the civil rights movement, and then eventually what we think of as the 60s came about. The fact that Obama came in with enormous expectations and then really failed to live up with them, at least on this issue. I mean, you can argue across the board, but certainly on the issue of the banks and regulating the banks and bringing them to heel after their malfeasance. His inaction is what's inspired this upswelling, and it goes deep enough that it'll be cultural in addition to political.
The best sign I saw today, I wrote down a bunch of signs, and maybe we'll post some of them to Facebook or to the show page as well. But one of the more notable ones I saw was Obama, the same old hope-a-dope strategy.